or shipment somewhere else. So the legal manufacturers could say, we just sent it to St. Pierre. We don't know what happened to it after that.
The liquor would then make its way to the U.S. coasts, where the large ships would anchor 3 to 5 miles offshore, outside U.S. coastal limits.
So every summer you would have what were called motherships off the coast of anywhere from Boston to South Jersey, and small ships would go out and take the booze off. It was so common, of course, that you could go to New York and tourist ships would take you out, and you could watch the bootleggers at work.
The Coast Guard would send high-speed boats out to try and intercept the bootleggers. But sometimes the corruption of Prohibition reached them, too. Once, Oni Madden's partner bribed a Coast Guard cutter to bring in 700 cases of booze to a Manhattan dock. For the bootlegger who got his shipment ashore, the challenges weren't over. Anybody who wanted to hijack his booze could do so. It was frequently known where the booze was going, even what truck it was on. And this in turn meant that rival bootleggers had to hire gunmen to protect their trucks, which proved yet another step in fostering the armed mobsters who would control organized crime. Prohibition had been meant to herald an era of sobriety and clean living. Instead, it was the dawn of unprecedented violence in American life. Gangsters were becoming a way of life. And few cities would prove to be more tainted, more corrupt, and more violent than the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. It was a town where the politicians were bootleggers, the cops were criminals, and the good times rolled. Philadelphia, in the 1920s, America's second largest city. The rivers ran murky in this town. February 1927, the city witnessed its first machine gun slaying, a murder worthy of the movies. That night's evening bulletin used a photo diagram to show how it happened. Racket chieftain Mickey Duffy was the target. Badly wounded, he escaped with his life. His bodyguard died. So what was going on in this city of brotherly love, Philadelphia? This was one of America's oldest, most respected cities. It called itself the workshop of the world and led the nation in producing locomotives, streetcars, textiles, and even hats. It was a proud place, with a blue blood upper class that lived on historic Chestnut Hill and along the so-called Main Line. But there was another side to Philadelphia, less proper, more seamy. Philadelphia didn't just lead the nation in industrial production. It was a leader in corruption. It was a one-party town. The Republican machine had run the city since the 1870s. The politicians ran a protection racket, being paid off by the gambling houses, the prostitutes, and the saloon keepers. Philadelphia's best-known mobster was Boo Boo Hoff. He had grown up in a Jewish immigrant neighborhood in South Philadelphia.
Boo Boo Hoff, who was the most important bootlegger in Philadelphia, was a relatively small man. Looked really very much like any small businessman. That is, nobody would have mistaken him for a criminal, or certainly for a guy who may have been behind violence.
He didn't look much like a gangster, had no reputation himself for violence, although obviously his bootlegging operations involved occasional killings and beatings. Any major bootlegging operation necessarily had to include such things.
Boo Boo Hoff had an office in a downtown bank building. It was here that he ran his unique blend of legal and illegal enterprises.
He had good ties with some of the top police officers. Probably in part not so much through his bootleggings as through a shared interest in boxing. I mean, this was a guy who owned boxers, who was part of the sporting world of Philadelphia, and would have gotten to know lots of politicians and policemen at fights.
It's a crooked enterprise in large measure in those days. There are many fixed fights, there are many fixed odds, bets are often smelly. It's a natural place for the gangsters, and it also gives them a cover. If they're in another city away from their base to have a meeting with a gangster, they can say they're just there for a boxing match. And obviously there's a connection between the violence of boxing and the violence of the underworld. The gangsters of all people were not going to object to the violence of boxing. They liked it. It's blood. It's something they're used to and comfortable with. It's a natural place for them.
Boo Boo Hoff used his political connections to move into a number of profitable areas. With the onset of Prohibition, he turned his attention to Philadelphia's massive industrial alcohol industry, to companies like Publickers and Quaker Industrial Alcohol.
What they're doing then is redistilling the alcohol to make it palatable, consumable in beverages. Unfortunately, they typically don't do a very good job of this. And the city coroner reports that 10 to 12 people a week are dying from alcohol poisoning. And it's probably an undercounting because, of course, if Dad has died from tainted gin, his family doesn't want the neighbors or the minister to find out about it.
It would be wonderful to have a good drink of this before lunchtime.
Only part of Philadelphia's alcohol was doctored. Most of the rest arrived via Europe and Canada. Sometimes it came straight up the Delaware through the docks, and sometimes, just sometimes, the Coast Guard caught the bootleggers. But more often than not, Philadelphia's booze made its way in via Rum Row. Philadelphia's bootleggers had a perfect area for smuggling, among the vast stretches of tidal salt marshes on the Delaware Bay. There were few people there, just isolated fishing and farming families.
So the mobsters from Philadelphia would go down to South Jersey and they would hire, particularly after the Depression hit, they would hire these oystermen, fishermen who couldn't make a living anymore at their trades and stick them on a powerboat. They'd run out to the ships, waiting ships from Canada or whatever. They'd fill it, the rum-running boat with booze, often in steel cases in case they had to dump it if a revenue or cutter came along and pick it up later. And then they'd run the stuff into these isolated rivers, creeks, and inlets along the bay and the Delaware estuary. The farmers then warehoused the stuff, and it could stay there for a week, a day, or months. And it became a very important part of the local economy.
The mobsters didn't just hand over the drink to their clients. They wanted a bigger piece of the action. They moved into entertainment.
There's a natural connection between the bootleggers and the nightclubs because where do the nightclubs get their liquor? Obviously from the bootleggers. So the bootleggers become partners with many of the people running the nightclubs at that time, and ultimately they own many of the clubs.
Boo Boo Hoff ran the Turf Club in the Sylvania Hotel and several other clubs, which attracted the city's upper class. At the speakeasies, the elite could rub elbows with the underworld.
The speakeasy was the daring in place to go. Anybody who was anybody wanted to be seen in these kinds of places. You had to have a business card to get in. You had to know the owner. There was a daringness to it. There was a bravado. In a sense, it was kind of a voyeuristic thrill. You were doing something daring. You were tweaking the nose of Uncle Sam, while at the same time experiencing a great new art form in jazz. Socializing with the highbrows of society and the literati and the Gold Coast mavens. It was a wonderful time to be alive.
Now here's a very entrancing phrase. It will put you in a daze. But to me it don't mean a thing, 'cause it's got a very peculiar swing.
Many of America's most famous musicians played in the speakeasies, also rubbing elbows with mobsters.
There was a certain affinity between the gangsters and the jazzmen. They have a certain common ground, nocturnal habits, a style of dressing, disapproval by the straight world, things to hide, glamorous women, secrets. They understood each other in interesting ways at a time when blacks and whites had very little contact as social peers.
There was no question who ran the show. Take New York's Cotton Club, one of the fanciest nightclubs in the country. Its ownership was concealed, but the boss was Owney Madden. Owney Madden wants the best entertainers. He wants Duke Ellington, and he's distressed when in 1927, the Duke goes to play at Philadelphia's Standard Theater.
So Owney Madden calls down to his buddy in Philadelphia, Maxie Boo Boo Hoff, and Boo Boo Hoff sends his associate, Charlie Yankee Schwartz, over to the manager of the Standard, who delivers his famous line, "Be big or be dead." And Ellington and the orchestra pack up their bags, head back to New York, and begin their famous engagement at the Cotton Club.
And thereafter, anytime Ellington wants to take his band on the road, he has to pay Cab Calloway's band to take his place at the Cotton Club. The connection is that tight. Essentially, Madden owns Ellington's band in those years.
In Philadelphia, the sound of music was turning ugly, and the bell began to ring for reforms. When the city elected a new mayor, Freeling Kendrick, he asked President Coolidge to send someone to clean up the city. Marine Brigadier General Smedley Darlington Butler arrived and started a determined campaign to stomp out crime and enforce prohibition. Butler discovered that nearly everyone was on the take: the police, the politicians, and the mobsters.
Butler becomes increasingly frustrated. He goes public with his frustrations. He gets in arguments with the mayor. And finally, before leaving after the end of his second year, in a speech before a group of women in Pittsburgh, he calls Philadelphia a cesspool on the edge of the state and says that Philadelphia simply lacks the will or resolve to enforce prohibition.
Philadelphians are upset about the situation. So in 1928, Judge Edwin Lewis convenes a grand jury to look into the matter. He takes lots of evidence from lots of witnesses, and the story is grisly. The extent of the graft, he estimates that about $2 million a year is being paid to Philadelphia cops and politicians by the bootleggers.
In August 1928, the jury announced its findings. It was a damning indictment of the Philadelphia police. They had discovered 24 high-ranking officers with bank accounts worth about $750,000. Not bad when the average policeman's salary was only about $2,000 a year. The policemen came up with some weak excuses. Some said they had been lucky in crap games. Others that they had bet on the right horse. In the end, 138 policemen were found unfit for service.
Boo Boo Hoff, the grand jury's final statement, says it's probably behind all of this, but we can't indict him. He's too insulated by fronts and covers. And so the grand jury really amounted to not very much. Some interesting information, but no arrests. No prosecutions came from it. They could not touch Boo Boo Hoff.
Boo Boo Hoff survived Prohibition without going to jail. But there were crime fighters who refused to give up. And one was an extraordinary young woman, at the time a rare figure in American justice.
Alcohol is hindering the coming of world peace because it is befuddling the thinking of humanity.
It is no laughing matter today when the National Survey of Education on Alcoholism states that one out of every 6 boozers are women.
It was the women's movement, the suffragettes, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the powerful Anti-Saloon League that had been the driving force behind Prohibition. So it was logical, if somewhat radical, for a woman, Mabel Walker Willebrandt, to be asked to enforce the new law.
A woman was very important to be in that position because Prohibition was looked at as a woman's issue. Women had just gotten the vote. So it was a high visibility position. It was a moral crusade to many people.
Mabel Walker Willebrandt was an unusual woman. She was born in Kansas. began school at 13, was a principal by 22,